You're golden, you're so golden. What you got, you're the golden child. I see forever between you and me, forever between us.
Welcome back to the Black in Real Life Podcast. It's your girl Anuli here with a new episode. This episode features the first formal interview of Season 2. Visiting heritage sites like museums implicates both curators and visitors in the construction and reconstruction of meaning-making and identity formation. In the book The Uses of Heritage, heritage and museum studies scholar Laura Jane Smith defines a practice of heritage as the management and conservation protocols, techniques, and procedures that heritage managers, archaeologists, architects, museum curators, and other experts undertake. The term heritage is itself grounded in the European idea of inheritance, meaning that people are defined by what they own. So as more museums emerged in the 19th century, cultural property in the form of museum collections played an important role in constructing the nation-state and the boundaries of nationalism, regionalism, localism. What I'm trying to say here is that museum objects came to represent larger bodies of knowledge, and the object as specimen paradigm became embedded into our social and cultural practices. Museums are established as sites of colonization in this way. But is it at all possible for museums to serve as sites of decolonization? The Atlanta Historical Society was founded in 1926 to preserve and study Atlanta history. In 1990, after decades of collecting, researching, and publishing information about Atlanta and the surrounding area, the organization officially became Atlanta History Center. Today's guest is Kristian Weatherspoon, the Vice President of Digital Storytelling at Atlanta History Center. Kristian, who also goes by Chris, has 10 years of digital journalism experience and has worked with news, public policy, and government organizations to deliver content to diverse audiences and amplify untold stories across digital and social media platforms. In this episode, we talk about the role institutions like Atlanta History Center play in interpreting history, and we also talk about the lasting impact of the 1996 Summer Olympic Games on the city. Also, of course, we have to talk about Atlanta's influence in the southern United States as a region and America as a whole. At the end of each interview, I will come back to share a few key takeaways that stood out to me from our conversation. If you listened to Season 1, you're very familiar with this practice. I am continuing it in Season 2. These takeaways will be supplemented with research from both academic and non-academic sources to add further context to subjects that were brought up in the interview portion. For every episode, I will include citations to the reference materials I mentioned, as well as some additional background reading for you on the Black in Real Life website. Visit www.blkirl.com to nerd out. Okay, now without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Kristian Chris Weatherspoon, the Vice President of Digital Storytelling at Atlanta History Center. Just a quick disclaimer, our Wi-Fi was going a bit in and out during our conversation, so there's some parts of the sound that were difficult to recapture, but overall, it does not take away from the depth of our conversation. Just, the perfectionist in me wanted to call that out.
I think one of the best ways to begin to talk about this is, one of my favorite quotes is Carol Moseley Braun, the first African-American woman in the Senate. She said, defining myself as opposed to being defined by others is like one of the most difficult challenges that I face. And I always think about that quote, number one, kind of as a Black woman, but in this space, I think it just rings so true to me because, history really, in some cases, has belonged to the people who told it. And I think as a historical institution, especially in this age where there's so much access to everything, it is so important that we use the resources that we have to really expand kind of the history that's been traditionally shared and told. And that means that, you know, history doesn't belong to one group of people. And so again, like I said, as a historical institution, it really, I think it's really our responsibility to lift up, undertold stories in communities that have traditionally not just been silenced, but communities that have been ignored in so many regards. And I think, that is, why this role here for me is so important at the History Center. It's a direct line to doing that. It's a direct line to reaching out to communities, not even just, not even asking for things or, asking for them to, to give us your story, give us in a transactional kind of way, but building trust, you know, working in communities, being honest about the fact that, for so many years, like I said, the history that exists in a lot of these places within Atlanta and beyond have just not been told. And so I think that's the first step is kind of acknowledging that. But then being open and really being open to what do communities want to share, let communities dictate that. And I think that's so important. I think I mentioned this to you at while you were here. I think so much of this work is and, when kind of you look at the explosion of even like digital journalism, and anyone can be a journalist. You can go into your local community, interview people, talk to people. You look at podcasting, like it's taken kind of that off of journalism as a thing off of its pedestal and brought it down to an everyday level, which I think has been so important to not just journalism but to history, because now there are no barriers, and communities are able to tell and share their own history. And as a historical institution, as a cultural institution, we need to be a part of that, because when you talk about Atlanta, you can't talk about Atlanta without exploring the rich legacies of Black people in Atlanta. You can't talk about Atlanta without talking about not just the struggles, but the triumphs of folks. And it goes beyond civil rights. I think it starts there. It begins in some regard there, but even before, there's so much before that story and after that story that's continuing to happen. I mean, you look at the explosion of Black tech here in Atlanta,
Mm-hmm.
and how there are so many young Black women leading that charge in this space. Like, that is history. We need to history really is happening right now around us. And so, like I said, as a cultural and historical institution, like, that's our job. We need to capture that, because decades from now, it'll be, hopefully it'll be a part of a historical record that is shared with our children, grandchildren, and beyond.
And I want to get to one part of that history. I know from our previous conversations, you've talked to me about the ways of Black leadership, starting with
Mhm.
Maynard Jackson, and how leaders like him had made it possible for Atlanta to grow economically. And so, can you talk about the importance of Black leadership in a city like Atlanta and how that kind of distinguishes the city?
For sure. Yeah, and kind of just my general research around, and I'll preface this with, I am certainly no Maynard Jackson, expert or historian, but there is no corner of Atlanta that you touch that has not been impacted by his legacy. Honestly, for me in Atlanta, next to MLK, he has been kind of one of the most influential figures in this city. And I think I was reading and I read a quote that John Lewis had, and he said that he called Maynard Jackson a founding father of the new Atlanta. And when I saw that, I was like, wow, it really just sums up everything that he was. And the fact that he was in his 30s, he was a young Black man, like, with vision, with the foresight to be able to see what Atlanta could be, and not to just see what it could be, for one group of people, but he saw what Atlanta could be for Black folks. And I think he saw it in Atlanta before a lot of people saw it. And so I think, when you look at, the many strides that he made in so many areas, including like building Black economic wealth in Atlanta, through his expansion at the airport. I mean, Hartsfield Jackson, which obviously bears his name for great reason. Like I said, his impact is just, is you can't even really explore it fully, because it was just that, impactful. But yeah, like I said, when you look at, his impact around building economic wealth and helping Black people get access to not just, more money and in a financial way, but helping Black people, gain access to a different level of just success. When you think about Atlanta, again, especially as a Black person, I think it's one of the first things you think about is that, wow, I can move to Atlanta, I can go to Atlanta, I can thrive, I can go out on my own. There's a reason you see such a large concentration of Black entrepreneurs here, because I think the work that he did helped to lay that groundwork. I think when you talk about, not just Maynard Jackson, of course, he is kind of the standard. But Atlanta has, I think, benefited from a sustained Black leadership that has, made the difference. When you have a Maynard Jackson and his legacy, but you've had, mayors to come after to not just uphold the legacy, but to build upon it, and to help Atlanta become, what it is now. So, like I said, I think, for him, like I said, he is a giant here for a reason. And I think, his history and his legacy is one that really, like I said, being from the South, and kind of looking at, like I said, the foresight that he had, and the progressive nature of, what he knew he could do for Atlanta. I can't help but think that so many other, urban Black cities, could benefit from that same vision and that same kind of tenacity that Maynard Jackson had. So that's my ode to him.
I do want to highlight the John Lewis quote that you shared earlier
Yeah.
in your response about the new Atlanta, because I have lived in quite a few urban Black cities: DC, Boston, Chicago, New York. And one thing that makes Atlanta stand out to me is just the division between old Atlanta and new Atlanta. Can you talk a little bit about like what that division is, what when new Atlanta started, what is old Atlanta?
So I think here, if you touch down in Atlanta, you're not going to get too far and not hear, oh, this is old Atlanta and this is new Atlanta. I think at a very basic level, you know, old Atlanta is Atlanta pre-gentrification. The time, where so many of these, so many neighborhoods that may have been, traditionally kind of, occupied by, people of color, have now become, very gentrified areas in the city. And I think when you talk about that new Atlanta specifically, I think you cannot explore that new Atlanta without exploring kind of at what cost. And I think, we look at even important and kind of, milestone marker events like the Olympics in '96 here in Atlanta. Yes, it did help to usher in kind of a new way of thinking for not just Atlantans, but a new way how people outside of Atlanta thought about Atlanta. Atlanta was an underdog, but after the Olympics, Atlanta, the way that people, saw the city, it changed. It became, it pushed it on to being that global city, that mecca that we now know it to be. And like I said, I think when you talk for explore at what cost, you have issues, like I said, around specifically gentrification, displacement, people just losing access to the city that was home to them. And I don't think that, I think it's important, to explore that. And I think, we do a great job, with that in our exhibitions here on campus. We have an Atlanta '96 exhibition that specifically explores that. And so when you look at things like the Olympics and, some of the first organizations to really question, how will the games coming here, impact communities. There were local organizations who worked in low income neighborhoods in communities in Atlanta and worked with homeless populations because they knew what the impact of development and the preparation for the games would do. And so, I would, encourage any of, your listeners to visit our website, and peruse and take a look through our Atlanta 96 exhibition, but take a look through our blogs that explore those really important, issues. And so I think it goes without saying that kind of after the Olympics, you did see a bit of a new Atlanta. But like I said, it really is important to kind of understand kind of at what cost. And I think you still, and it's important to explore that. And I think it again goes to telling that complete story of not just the progress that is Atlanta, but the work that Atlanta still has.
One of my favorite parts of your 1996 exhibition was learning that Olympics, not only was it the centennial of the Olympics as a whole, but also it was the first digital
Mhm.
Olympics, which is a new fact for me that goes, I study social media and technology. So, oh, wow, another connection. Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. To your point, in the 90s, the digital revolution was there. It was happening. And I think when we think back about, just think back to, our childhood. I'm 35 and I think back to my childhood in the 90s. I can remember kind of inflection points like kind of the cell phone. We
Mm-hmm.
started to kind of see that in the 90s. You saw computer graphics, the animated things. Nintendo 64.
Yeah,
Do you
I had one.
you remember? You
Yeah,
right.
Donkey
And
Kong.
that was no exactly. And that was all during that time. And so when it came to the Olympics, I think it was, inevitable that tech game, that technology, that burgeoning technology, should I say, be included in that. And so I think, that manifested itself in things during the Olympics here in Atlanta, like you had virtual venues, where people could, we actually have an interesting thing in one of our exhibitions, like one of those, it was a tall kiosk that housed like a television. I think they were meant to like be at kind of certain, venues, where certain games were happening. But the idea was just to, give you computer simulations and just, provide you kind of information about, I think what today, I guess when I saw it, I likened it to, when you're in the airport and you see your flight up on the screen. There were things like that were supposed to
Mm-hmm.
kind of, help give you just, different information. But I mean, you think in the 90s, that was new. And so I think in addition to, like I said, the fact that it was in Atlanta, a place that was so unexpected for many people, the idea that, Atlanta, Georgia Tech specifically, kind of was at the helm of making the Olympics like very first kind of digital game was just another testament, I think, to the innovation that is Atlanta. And another reason that it made those games wildly successful and just memorable. I also think in the 96 games, it was kind of the first games to have a website.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was just, there were just so many things. And I think the really cool thing about looking back on that now really is, so there's so much nostalgia around it. It really is. Like the 90s was such a nostalgic time. And I think even now, being in the city and being able to see the impact years later of the Olympics, pair that kind of with the nostalgia that is just the nostalgia of the 90s and our childhood. I think for our generation, I don't know, there's just something, again, it just adds to, I guess, kind of the magic that is it. So,
Yeah, you definitely see imprints of the Olympics throughout the city because I've once been to Mexico City and they hosted an Olympic Games in the 70s and all of the Olympic remnants are kind of like located in one area of the city, whereas in Atlanta, all parts of the city, I see a little bit of the remnants, some torches here, some
the
statues here,
torches. Mhm.
like all throughout the city. So it seems to me, unlike any most other cities, that Atlanta still holds the game in this like high prominence.
It absolutely does. And I think, when you think about kind of the structure that was able to build and prepare for the Olympics here in Atlanta, again, I think it's just another testament to the great leadership that this city has benefited from. So you had a Maynard Jackson, you had Andrew Young, and Billy Payne, who were able to all come together, two black and one white guy who came together and despite anything else, could see the vision and could see how, number one, see how Atlanta, had the capacity and could build the capacity to host an Olympic Games, but also had the tenacity to say, I don't care that folks think we can't get it. We're still gonna go and vie for it anyway. And it worked out. It worked out in our favor. And I think because of that, I think that's why you do see so much. Because can't really I can't really intimate, I think, just how much the games help to really change Atlanta. And I think as far as you talk about kind of putting Atlanta, I guess, on the map, which, I won't say the games just did that. People knew of Atlanta for sure. But like I said, I think it surely raised Atlanta's profile to the nation and to the world.
So we have the games. I would also love to hear about the airport, because I would imagine that people from all over the world wouldn't be able to come to Atlanta if it had not been for like having an international airport.
Yeah, for sure. I think, when you look at the kind of that international, I think it's important to even to pull back and even talk about, like, why Atlanta?
Yes,
why why do folks want to come to it? I think Atlanta is one of the one of the few places that there's a huge transplant culture here, of course. We all know that. And I think when you think about why, as a transplant myself, there's a whole understanding of, as a transplant, I think you're looking for maybe, three things, especially people in this southern region. And I think, for many of us having grown up here in this region, I think we kind of understand kind of how politics plays a role in, maybe keeping a city from being as progressive as it needs to be. Coming from Mississippi, I understand, right? I think you all also understand how, things like brain drain is a real thing.
Yeah.
When you leave it, when you're in a place where you don't feel like there's a ton of opportunity, you tend to, seek that out elsewhere. And I think that so many people look at Atlanta as the exact opposite of all of those things. And I think when you look at, three primary things: opportunity, access, and progress, Atlanta has all of those things. I mean, you can come here and say you can, there's enough here for you to bootstrap it and kind of figure, there's this meme on Instagram and Twitter that has been going around that says, when all else in your life is failing, just move to Atlanta. Have you seen?
No, but I'm wondering, why Atlanta? There's so many cities in the South.
Yeah, but cities in the South, I mean, like I said, you can't beat, like I said, the progressive nature of Atlanta.
Yeah.
There's so much to do. I mean, pretty much every, Fortune 500 company has a headquarters here. So you have jobs, you have opportunity. And when you look at economics and just businesses are coming here in droves, because land and labor are both cheap. You even look at the explosion of tech coming here. That, like I said, land and labor are both cheaper here than in Silicon Valley, but you also have the brain power. You have a Georgia Tech here that has, that produces that's basically an incubator for Silicon Valley. So it's the best of both worlds for everyone, for business, for for young people looking to thrive, especially for young African Americans, looking for something at the intersection of kind of, quality of life and building careers. Like, you can do it all here. Everyone has their own personal reasons, but I think it's a mix of kind of all of those things, when you talk about why Atlanta. And then, again, that, you have such a rich legacy and just a rich history for Black people. Like I said, you can go from kind of, civil rights and kind of the struggle that Black folks have endured and come out of, but you also go into, like I said, a Maynard Jackson and, the first Black mayor, then to a Shirley Franklin, first Black female mayor. You move from that struggle to that to that success, to that progress, and then to now, it's everywhere. It's, that success is absolutely everywhere. So I think that's kind of, why Atlanta. Like I said, everyone has their own reasons, but I would imagine that rich history, there really is a feeling in the air that, like I said, anything is possible. And then I forgot the other half of the question. Anuli, what was the other part of the question?
Well, before we go and talk about the airport itself, I am curious, like, there's still, like, what is it about the city? Like, you can't just bottle it up and take it to, like, Jackson, Mississippi. Like, why is it like the location? Like what is it that all these people came to this area like historically then and kind of started these things that like can't be replicated in other southern cities or other cities
Well,
across the
yeah, I think, like I said, I think it is a mix, like I said, of that kind of sustained leadership. But I think
Yes, leadership.
Yeah, I think when Atlanta figured out kind of the formula for them, Atlanta also, I think, became just indispensable to, to the state of Georgia. And so I think whereas a lot of other southern cities, urban kind of metropolitan cities, may be kind of in the middle of kind of really regressive and legislative, bodies and groups. Well, because Atlanta is such a huge economic driver and such a
Yeah.
huge cultural driver for Georgia, it's indispensable. So, Atlanta has truly written its own way. And I think that, when you talk about business and economics and money, Atlanta has all of that, has all of that. And of course, with those three things come influence.
Yeah.
So I think that undoubtedly, and those are things that are very difficult to replicate in other southern cities. That it is. It's a very difficult thing to replicate. So, like I said, I think it's important to again, but you can ask a million different experts that question and you'll get a million different answers.
I bet.
So that's just mine. Let me just give you that caveat. All right. But yeah, I think as far as the airport is concerned, you look at, again, the demand has to be there. And I think Atlanta created that demand and folks want to be in Atlanta. But I think that's why, again, Maynard Jackson's years, ahead of his time with his vision for, like I said, what Atlanta could be, in expanding that terminal internationally, he had to have known that so much business would come here to set up shop. He had to have known that the center of kind of cultural life in the South would grow to be here, or he had to have had some inkling. So again, I think a lot of it is just chance, foresight, and great leadership. And I think, when you meld all three of those together, and again, great leadership that allows you to expand, an airport and to give minorities contracts to help create wealth in Black communities in Atlanta. Well, all of that stuff just helps to build. It just helps to build communities, and I think that's in part kind of what the airport has done and continues to do. If I'm not mistaken, airport is still one of the largest employers in the state, and it was, excuse me, in the city. So and I think again that was meant to be. That's by design. Yeah, I think that when you look at kind of, like I said, a formula around how do you do that, I think that in part is it. But I think the hard and the sad reality is that there aren't many cities that can replicate what Atlanta has. And that just is the truth. And that's why people just come here. You just come to live here. And you be a part of it. You just be a part of it. Even if your town has not figured it out yet. So
I mean, there is the influence Atlanta has in the southern region, like you mentioned, but now we're also seeing like a national Atlanta's having like, music industry. You can hear like the prevalence of like the trap sound or like the trap aesthetics. Also, just thinking about like social media, a lot of like the trends are starting in Atlanta. I'm wondering also to add to this conversation and also politics, right? Like the flipping the state. Is Atlanta having another renaissance, or is this a continuation of what has always just like seeing it?
I think it's a healthy mix of both. And I think again that's the beauty of Atlanta. They're always surprising you. And so I think because I think was it yesterday or no, it was the day. I think it was Sunday. It was like the 25th anniversary of the Source Awards where Outkast got up and said the South has got something to say. Yeah, I think it was like the 25th anniversary of
Yeah,
that.
that's actually
But
where my project starts.
yeah, right. I think it's on this one. So I think when you look at kind of that inflection point and you look at but that's the thing though. Like even in our 90s childhood, like, we've known music to kind of come out, to come out of Atlanta. We were never old enough to go, but we all knew about Freaknik. And so
Yeah, yeah,
we all knew about Freaknik and about the phenomenon that was Freaknik. And I tell people, like, as
oh
far as
wow, it
innovation,
was August 3rd. Yeah,
it was August 3rd,
1995.
wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
So that's why I was just like, yeah, it was that. So, and so you look at that kind of one inflection point, but then you also think about, because you think about, Freaknik, and we all know how it ended. But you see all as far as innovation goes, you see all these outdoor festivals and all that stuff now. Man,
Yeah.
Atlanta been doing that.
You right.
Okay,
You right.
been doing that. So like I said, it just goes to the idea of the city just being able to just incubate just innovation. And it's just the beauty of the city. And so, but yeah, like I said, I think music has definitely, because I do think, in a cheesy way, cliche way, music really is a universal language. When you talk about like just music, it's not just the music, it's I hate to be that millennial, but it's the swag. It really is. And I think, when you talk about influence, that's what it is. Like you gotta be the place people want to be. And the music has helped to make Atlanta that. I'd argue that for folks in our generation, that probably was kind of some of our first experience with Atlanta was the music.
Yeah.
Was Outkast, was Usher, was all of these artists who were like, oh, okay, yeah, this is Atlanta. I want to go there. It's cool. I remember coming here and going to underground Atlanta, coming from Mississippi and going to underground Atlanta and hoping I'd run into like a Usher or somebody or a TLC or
Yeah.
somebody famous, which I never did, of course. But I think again, also for like I said, for this region, like I think for many of us, like I said, I can remember as a child, wanting to come here and wanting to visit because there was just so much here, so much culture, so much culture here, and so much access to just to everything. And so I think as you look at music, I think music kind of helped to shape that, because like I said, it was marketable, and it put Atlanta on a stage that allowed the city to I don't know, to do their own thing. And I think it's what artists, you look at Outkast, that's their hallmark. They were like nothing else that came out of any East or West Coast, and they knew that, and that made them attractive and marketable.
Yeah.
So, because I know the world had never seen anything like Andre 3000, dressing the way he did, rapping the way they did with with the Southern drawl, with the, with the emphasis on certain words. Like, no, you didn't see that. And so I think, again, another testament to just what Atlanta is. I interviewed, yesterday we talked with, actually Andrew Young, Ambassador Young.
Oh wow.
And he said, amongst the many quotables he said, nobody understands Atlanta. They think they understand it, but they don't. And I looked around, I was like, you're kind of right. Like, I think people think they understand Atlanta, but I don't think one really does, because I don't know, it's just that unique. But like I said, I think music helped to kind of usher that in. But then I think when you look at, of course, now politics, which has thrust the city into obviously a huge spotlight, after these Senate races. But then you also have a Stacey Abrams, who is here, and able to, kind of being that new voice, of kind of influence and power in not just the South now, but across the country now. But she was here. She organizes here. She organized here. She laid the groundwork, arguably, to for those helped lay the ground. But she's so many Black women in this political space here, leading the charge to register voters, and to fight voter suppression, like all of those things. A lot of it being led by Black women in this city. So, because I think all of that is important. I just think that I really do believe that kind of the new face, kind of the new frontier, kind of in fighting for kind of equity and kind of civil rights, voter suppression, specifically because it is happening so much here in the South and in Georgia specifically. It's going to be led again by Georgia and Atlanta specifically. And so I think, out of that same struggle that you saw, during the civil rights movement, like I think like I said, that same tenacity and that same drive is still here in this city. And I think you see it in so many of the people you see kind of organizing on the ground here, like I said, in politics here, like you can't help but think that but know that John Lewis's spirit is still here and still working. Like how could it not? Like how could it not? So the big shoes to fill. But once again, I think Atlanta specifically is gonna be at the forefront, leading the charge.
I want to close with a question. This is a question I've been asking everyone I've done these more formal interviews with, and that is like who, what, or where represents Black Atlanta to you?
I guess as far as a physical location, for me, is that what you mean, like a physical space?
Could be anything. Just when you think about
Okay.
Black Atlanta, you think about this thing, person, place, thing.
Again, because being from the South myself, I'm automatically connected deeply, kind of with the with civil rights, and so for me, I grew up kind of understanding, a Medgar Evers and a Fannie Lou Hamer and all of those people, and having a deep, respect and understanding for them. When I visited Ebenezer, for the first time in the King Center, and his home, which I think is still closed nowadays.
Yeah,
But
it is.
yeah, but when I visited those places, I think it took me back even to my childhood and kind of understanding the gravity of what happened here and like the gravity of like just the great like sacrifice that people made. Like I said, that question is always in my mind. Like I said, at what cost? How are we here? And when I think about, like I said, the great like cost and just I just think about, I can't even imagine, living under the weight and the fear of just all kinds of things that so many of those leaders in that time had to live through. And that deeply resonates with me because, I have uncles who organized with like Bob Moses and would have crosses burned in their yards, and it just was, I think we sometimes we can take it for granted because we have progressed so much. We still got a long way to go because we have progressed so much. But when I visit those places, I know it's cliche, but when I visit those places, I don't know, I just feel it's weird. I just feel a deep connection with that. During the pandemic last year, in the heat of it, I needed to get out and I needed to just like get out of my house in a safe way. Didn't know how. I was tired of just like taking walks, around the neighborhood. So I got in the car, came down to downtown Atlanta, and I drove around. You see all the murals downtown.
Yeah.
So there's the John Lewis mural. There was the Black Girl Magic mural. I grabbed a friend and I said, let's just go like mural hopping that day and let's just go see what I see. And then when I got to the John Lewis one, there were people putting flowers out and it was, people were there. When I gathered, it was like a small grouping of people. We were all distanced, wearing masks, but all Black folks, and we were just there talking and they're hanging out because where the mural is, it's like a little parking lot area.
Yeah, I was there.
So we were just there hanging out, talking, kind of screaming across the way. Didn't know these people. They didn't know me. I didn't know them from anything. But I was like, oh, okay, y'all, this is what I needed. Like, it's Atlanta. Like, I just need to come out here and just decompress, like talk to people, get some human interaction. But some of the conversations led into, longer conversations about, oh, where are you from? Or where are you from? Because, of course, no one's from Atlanta, really. Everyone. And it ended up being a lot of transplants, but we all kind of started swapping stories about how long we've been here. And, we exchanged numbers. And so some of them I still keep up with, through the pandemic. But kind of just that day was just so indicative, I think, of like kind of what the spirit of Atlanta. So many people are from so many places, but Atlanta really is a connection point for so many people. And so I think, that for me is kind of the stuff that is so uniquely Atlanta. And then I guess as far as the geographical, like physical space, the Cascade area in Atlanta, I had seen the movie Roll Bounce. And so when I moved here, I was like, let me go to the skating rink. And
are you good skating? Are you
no,
a good
terrible.
skater?
I'm terrible at skating. But it was that spot. I love Roll Bounce. I was like, oh, let me go here and see. So went there, and that was my kind of introduction into the Cascade area. And because it is a very, historically, Black area, that it's kind of slowly being gentrified. It was just fascinating to kind of see this, older, Black folks who are actually from Atlanta and they are of the city,
Yeah.
still being there, still in their communities, still thriving, like with great stories to tell. And so one of my best friends in Atlanta ended up, having grown up in Cascade. And so it's like one of my favorite pastimes just to talk to her and she tell. I was like, how was it, how it used to be? Like how was it before all of us came, all of us moved in? And so to get her stories of old Atlanta are always so fascinating. And just again about the success and the progressiveness of people in that community. And it's not just unique to Cascade, several other, historically Black communities in this city. But, and that's so subsequently I joined a church in Cascade because I wanted to be a part of, that community.
After visiting Atlanta and the History Center to learn more about the legacy of the '96 Olympic Games, one phrase kept running through my mind: at what cost? Today I want to hop on this train of thought and travel through time to explore some of the ruins caused by the Games. I want to highlight some of the neighborhoods of people that were displaced and dispossessed to accommodate the Olympics. In September 1990, Atlanta won the bid to host the 1996 Summer Olympic Games, winning the bid to host the Centennial Games, the 100th anniversary of the modern Olympics, against the lineup of cities that included Athens, Greece. The host of the first modern Olympic Games was considered a major feat for the city. In spite of the approximately $2.5 billion price tag, the benefits derived from hosting the Olympic Games were expected to outweigh the costs. To prepare for the Games, the city prioritized cosmetic enhancements such as beautifying the downtown area over addressing serious infrastructure problems such as the inadequate sewer systems and deteriorating water systems in the city. Included in the city's beautification efforts was a renewal of its low-income neighborhoods. But as James Baldwin famously warned in the 1960s, urban renewal means Negro removal. City planners identified 9 neighborhoods as likely to be, quote, affected directly by activities either associated with or taking place as part of the 1996 Summer Olympic Games. Atlanta's 1995 City Development Plan, yes, I read the whole thing, lists these neighborhoods alphabetically as follows: Atlanta University, English Avenue, Georgia Tech, Home Park, Mechanicsville, Peoplestown Summerhill, Techwood Clark Howell, and Vine City Ashby. Of the identified neighborhoods, the greatest length of text was dedicated to outlining the revitalization of the Techwood Clark Howell neighborhood. The Techwood Clark Howell neighborhood would be redeveloped through private funding into a mixed-income, mixed-use neighborhood that city planners plotted to call Techwood Park. Techwood would serve as a model for the mixed-income communities that Atlanta would develop in the years to come, and its original residents would either move elsewhere in Atlanta or to the suburbs. An under-discussed aspect of Atlanta's history is the fact that Atlanta was the first city in the United States to complete construction on a public housing project. In 1936, Techwood Homes, named for nearby Georgia Tech, was developed to replace a stretch of blighted slums in Atlanta city center. Techwood Homes was considered an eyesore to city planners preoccupied with beautifying Atlanta as the city stepped on the world stage to host the Olympics. The Atlanta Housing Authority demolished Techwood Homes and replaced it with mixed-income housing in 1996 before the Olympic Games. By 2011, Atlanta became the first American city to close all of its public housing projects. Today, residents of historically Black neighborhoods like Peoplestown, located about 2 miles southeast of Atlanta's downtown, are still fighting to stay in their homes as gentrification accelerates in the city. If you're in the Atlanta metropolitan area, then you can visit Atlanta History Center to view the Atlanta 96 exhibition for yourself. After the games ended, Atlanta History Center was designated as a repository for the collections of the Georgia Amateur Athletic Foundation, the nonprofit behind the organizing committee of the 1996 Olympic bid and games. I visited the exhibition myself while in Atlanta, and I learned a lot. If you're unable to make it to Atlanta, then you can still visit and experience the exhibition's content online on the center's website. Yes, it is listed among the reference materials for this episode. You are welcome. You have just listened to a production of the Black in Real Life Podcast. The Black in Real Life Podcast is developed, produced, edited, and hosted by Anuli. The music was graciously provided by Garth, whose single Wild can be streamed anywhere you can find music. The intro music for this season includes an instrumental remix of Welcome to Atlanta by Jermaine Dupri featuring Ludacris. Thank you for listening, and remember, the people you follow online are also Black in real life.